The trial begins. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, anticipation thick in the air. The spectators, journalists, law students, and curious onlookers had packed the room, eager to witness what was expected to be nothing more than a routine case. Yet none of them knew the storm that was about to break. Judge Randall Wilkins, a man notorious for his no-nonsense demeanor and biting sarcasm, adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and peered over the bench. He was known for his intolerance of inefficiency, his tendency to belittle, and most of all, his unwavering belief that the court was his domain, a kingdom where he ruled unchallenged. At the center of the courtroom, a frail-looking elderly black woman stood at the defense table. She wore a simple brown dress, her silver hair neatly pinned into a bun. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp to belong to someone lost or uncertain. Yet, to everyone else in the room, she looked out of place. Judge Wilkins clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with condescension, "are you representing yourself?" The room let out a collective chuckle. Even the young prosecutor, Thomas Barrett, smirked. He was dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, his confidence bordering on arrogance. To him, this was already a done deal. The plaintiff, Charles Duval, a well-known and well-connected real estate mogul, sat beside him, his smirk matching the prosecutor's. "This is a court of law, ma'am," Judge Wilkins continued, leaning back in his chair. "Not a town hall meeting. You do realize that, don't you?" More laughter. The elderly woman pursed her lips, her expression unreadable. She did not speak right away. Instead, she studied the judge, her piercing gaze steady and unyielding. Wilkins sighed and flipped through the case file before him. "Let me guess," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You've watched a few courtroom dramas, figured it wouldn't be too hard, and decided to play lawyer for a day. I highly advise you to reconsider. This case is serious, and quite frankly, I don't have time for." He stopped, because at that moment, the elderly woman reached into her purse, pulled out a worn leather folder, and slid it across the table. Thomas Barrett hesitated before picking it up. As he read the name on the documents, his smirk faltered. His hands trembled slightly as he passed the folder to Judge Wilkins. The judge took the folder, flipping it open with casual disinterest, until he saw the name. The room fell into silence. The color drained from Wilkins' face. His smirk disappeared, replaced with a look of stunned disbelief. He turned the pages, rereading them. Once, twice. Gasps rippled through the audience. A court clerk nearly dropped her coffee. Even Charles Duval, who had seemed so sure of his victory, paled. The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice strong and commanding. "Now, Judge Wilkins," she said, her words slicing through the silence, "would you like to continue mocking me? Or would you prefer to show some respect to a former Supreme Court attorney?" The room was frozen in shock. Judge Wilkins cleared his throat, his arrogance evaporated. "I wasn't aware of your, background, Mom," he stammered. "Save your apologies, Judge," the woman said coolly. "Let's get to the case." Hours earlier, the morning air was crisp as Eleanor Jackson stepped out of her small, modest home. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather briefcase, inhaling deeply before beginning her slow walk to the courthouse. She had walked these streets for decades, had seen the city change, had watched as justice evolved, and sometimes failed. But today was different. Today, she was not entering the courthouse as an attorney. She was entering as a defendant. A month ago, she had received the lawsuit. The plaintiff, Charles Duval, was accusing her of fraud, tampering with property records in a case nearly 30 years old. The charge was outrageous. Eleanor had spent her life fighting for justice, not manipulating it. The accusation was a direct attack on her legacy. She had reached out to former colleagues, but none were willing to take the case pro bono. And at her age, hiring an expensive attorney was out of the question. So she had only one choice. She would represent herself. The courthouse loomed ahead, its marble pillars towering over the people below. As she stepped inside, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She had argued some of the most important cases of the last half-century. She had changed laws. She had changed lives. And yet, today, people barely looked at her. To them, she was just another elderly woman. Someone past her prime. Someone who should be at home knitting, not fighting in a courtroom. She arrived early, sitting quietly at the defendant's table. Across the room, Charles Duval sat with his team of lawyers. He was a man who had built an empire on buying up land, pushing out the poor, and replacing their homes with luxury developments. He was a man used to winning. As the judge entered and the trial began, Eleanor braced herself. She had fought tougher opponents than this before, but never before had her own reputation been on the line. Back in the courtroom, after the stunned silence faded, Judge Wilkins composed himself and turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Barrett," he said, "do you wish to proceed?" Barrett hesitated. Yes, Your Honor," he said, scrambling to gather his notes. But Eleanor could already see it. His confidence was gone. Barrett cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the defense may have a, legal background, that does not change the fact that she has been accused of serious misconduct." Eleanor didn't flinch. Barrett continued, his voice a little less certain now. "The plaintiff, Mr. Charles Duval, has presented evidence suggesting that Ms. Jackson tampered with official property records 30 years ago, leading to an unfair ruling in favor of her client. We believe this constitutes fraud, and we seek full restitution." Judge Wilkins nodded. "Ms. Jackson, do you wish to respond?" Eleanor stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom. She turned to face Barrett directly. "Mr. Barrett," she said, "you claim that I tampered with property records. Tell me, have you personally examined these so-called falsified documents?" Barrett hesitated. "The evidence." "That wasn't my question," Eleanor interrupted. "I asked if you have seen them with your own eyes." Barrett exhaled sharply. "No, but my client." "Ah," Eleanor said, nodding. "Your client, Charles Duval, a man with a well-documented history of land fraud and predatory real estate practices." Duval shot up from his seat. "That's outrageous," he barked. "Your Honor, I object to this baseless attack on my character." Eleanor turned to Judge Wilkins. "Your Honor, I am merely pointing out the court records detailing Mr. Duval's previous lawsuits for fraud, land misappropriation, and illegal evictions, or shall I submit those as evidence as well?" The courtroom murmured. Judge Wilkins sighed. "Ms. Jackson, please keep your statements relevant." "Of course, Your Honor," Eleanor said, walking to the evidence table. "Let's talk about this case." Then, she picked up the allegedly falsified document, the one Duval claimed was proof of her fraud. And then she smiled, because someone had made a terrible mistake. The evidence crumbles. The courtroom was thick with tension. Every eye was on Eleanor Jackson as she held up the so-called falsified document. She adjusted her glasses, studying the yellowed paper carefully. The weight of decades of legal experience settled into her bones, sharpening her focus. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was war. And she was going to win. Eleanor slowly turned the document over in her hands. She ran a finger across the edges, feeling the fibers of the paper, the ink, the weight. Then she smirked. It was the kind of smirk that made prosecutors nervous. The kind of smirk that meant someone had just made a massive mistake. She looked up, eyes locked onto Thomas Barrett, the young, arrogant prosecutor. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "tell me, have you ever heard of forensic document analysis?" Barrett frowned. "Of course." "Good." Eleanor nodded. "Then you should know that even without advanced technology, a trained eye can determine whether a document is truly as old as it claims to be." She turned to Judge Wilkins. "Your Honor," she continued, I request that the court examine this document carefully, because what I hold in my hands is not an authentic legal record from 30 years ago." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even Judge Wilkins sat forward. "Are you saying the evidence has been tampered with?" "Not just tampered with," Eleanor said smoothly. "Completely fabricated." She turned back to Barrett. "Mr. Barrett," she said, holding up the document, "I want you to look at the ink on this paper. What do you see?" Barrett hesitated, then shrugged. "Ink." Eleanor's smirk deepened. "Modern ink, Mr. Barrett." She pointed at the writing. "Ink that has not faded. Ink that does not match the natural degradation expected of a 30-year-old document. Ink that looks suspiciously fresh." Barrett shifted uncomfortably. Judge Wilkins rubbed his chin. "That's a bold claim, Ms. Jackson. Do you have proof?" Eleanor pulled another document from her briefcase. "This," she said, placing it on the evidence table, "is a legal contract that I notarized in 1994. It has been stored under proper conditions, yet the ink has naturally faded due to oxidation over time." She placed the forged document beside it. "Now, compare that," she continued, "to this document, which claims to be from the same year. Yet its ink looks practically brand new." The courtroom murmured again. Eleanor wasn't done. She flipped the document over. "And then there's the paper itself," she said, tapping the surface. "Paper made in the early 90s has a distinct composition. Fibers that age and yellow over time, subtle texturing from the manufacturing processes of the era." She ran her fingers over it. "But this," she turned to the judge, "this is modern stock paper. This paper is nowhere near 30 years old." Judge Wilkins squinted at the document, then back at the original legal contract. His expression darkened. Eleanor delivered the final blow. "And finally," she said, her voice dangerously smooth, "let's look at the signature." She pulled another stack of papers from her briefcase. "This," she said, holding one up, "is my signature from 1994. She placed it beside the one on the alleged fraudulent document. "This," she held up another, "is my signature from last year." Then she placed it beside both. "Notice anything, Mr. Barrett?" she asked. Barrett's face was turning pale. "Let me help you," Eleanor continued. "My handwriting has remained consistent for decades, but the signature on the fraudulent document." She tapped it. "The stroke, the angle, the pressure distribution. It doesn't match my natural signature at all." Judge Wilkins picked up both documents, comparing them side by side. His lips tightened. "This," he muttered, "this signature is completely different." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Eleanor stepped forward, locking eyes with Charles Duval. "Tell me, Mr. Duval," she said coldly, "how exactly did you obtain this forged document?" Duval's face had gone red. I, he stammered. Eleanor let the silence stretch before delivering the final strike. "Or," she said smoothly, "should I ask who you paid to manufacture it?" The court erupts. The courtroom exploded. Journalists scrambled to take notes. Spectators gasped. Even the court stenographer paused mid-typing. Judge Wilkins banged his gavel. "Order," he shouted. "I will have order in my courtroom." But Eleanor Jackson had already flipped the case on its head. Duval's lawyer, a balding man with a deep frown, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Ms. Jackson is making wild accusations." Eleanor raised a single eyebrow. "Wild accusations," she repeated, "or irrefutable evidence." She gestured toward the documents in the judge's hands. "The facts are clear, Your Honor," she said. "The prosecution has based their entire case on a document that is demonstrably fraudulent. That means their argument, this entire lawsuit, is based on a lie." Judge Wilkins took a long breath, staring at the evidence before him. Then he turned to Thomas Barrett. "Mr. Barrett," he said slowly, "do you have an explanation for this?" Barrett looked like a trapped animal. His hands gripped the edges of the table. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. Eleanor folded her arms. "Well, Mr. Barrett?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. Barrett finally exhaled. I need a moment to confer with my client," he muttered. Eleanor smirked. "Take all the time you need." Duval's rage. Across the room, Charles Duval was fuming. His jaw clenched, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a swift, easy victory. Instead, he had been outplayed by a woman twice his age. His eyes burned with fury as he leaned toward Barrett and whispered something hurriedly. Eleanor watched him closely. Something wasn't right. Duval had the look of a man with a backup plan. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her. She had won this round, but something about the way Duval's lips curled into a sneer sent a chill down her spine. Judge Wilkins sighed. "Court is adjourned until further notice." He banged his gavel. But as Eleanor gathered her briefcase, she caught Duval staring at her. And the way he smiled, cold, knowing, dangerous, made her stomach twist. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A shadow in the courtroom. The gavel slammed down. "Court is adjourned until further notice." The words echoed through the grand chamber, but Eleanor Jackson knew they meant nothing. Not yet. She had won the battle, yes, but the war had only just begun. As the spectators began filing out of the courtroom, an eerie silence lingered. Journalists huddled together, whispering frantically. The court stenographer sat frozen, her fingers hovering over the keys. Even Judge Wilkins seemed rattled, rubbing his temples as if he already regretted calling for recess. But Eleanor wasn't focused on any of them. Her sharp, practiced eyes were locked on one man. Charles Duval. He was standing by the plaintiff's table, stiff as a statue, his fists clenched at his sides. His legal team swarmed him, whispering hurriedly, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at her, and he was smiling. A slow, predatory smirk curled across his lips, one that made the hairs on Eleanor's neck rise. This wasn't the smile of a man who had just been exposed for fraud in open court. This was the smile of a man with a backup plan. A warning comes too late. As Eleanor packed up her files, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, expecting to see Angela, her newly discovered ally in this fight. Instead, a tall, wiry man in a charcoal suit loomed over her. His face was sharp, his eyes calculating. Eleanor recognized him instantly. Martin Fay, one of the most well-connected lobbyists in Washington, a man known for making problems disappear for the right price. Her stomach tightened. "Ms. Jackson," he greeted smoothly, his voice as slick as oil. That was quite the performance. Eleanor adjusted her briefcase strap. "Cut to the chase, Fay. What does Duval want?" Fay's smirk didn't falter. "Oh, this isn't about Duval," he said. "This is about you." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You've caused a lot of trouble today," Fay continued. "Big people are watching, Ms. Jackson. The kind of people who don't like surprises." "Surprises?" Eleanor scoffed. "You mean exposing the truth?" Fay sighed, shaking his head. "You're an old woman, Ms. Jackson. No offense, but you should be enjoying your retirement. Instead, you're making enemies in places where enemies don't forgive." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her briefcase. "Is that a threat?" Fay leaned in closer, his breath cold against her cheek. "It's a warning," he murmured. "Walk away from this case, or you won't walk away at all." Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. "You tell whoever sent you," she said, voice like steel, "that Eleanor Jackson doesn't scare easy." For the first time, Fay's smirk faded. "You're making a mistake," he warned. But Eleanor had already turned away. A dead man's name. Eleanor exited the courthouse into the cold afternoon air. Angela Carter was waiting for her, arms crossed. The young woman looked anxious, her foot tapping against the pavement. "You took your time," Angela muttered. Eleanor exhaled, got held up by a ghost. Angela frowned. "What?" Eleanor shook her head. Never mind. Let's move. We need to talk somewhere safe. Angela nodded, leading Eleanor down the street toward a small cafe. The place was half empty, quiet enough to avoid eavesdroppers. As they sat down, Angela wasted no time. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice. "I didn't want to say this in court, but I found something else. In my mother's old files." Eleanor sat up straighter. "What did you find?" Angela hesitated, then reached into her bag. She pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Eleanor opened it and froze, because staring back at her from the first page was a name she had not seen in 30 years. Franklin Rourke, the man who had died under mysterious circumstances just months after Marissa Carter vanished. A journalist, a whistleblower, a man who had tried to expose something and paid for it with his life. Eleanor's fingers traced the old photograph stapled to the file. "He was investigating Duval," Angela murmured. "And not just him, other powerful men." Eleanor flipped through the documents. They were old financial records, faded but intact. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, names that meant nothing except for one. Her breath caught. Senator Richard Langston. Angela nodded grimly. "I think my mother knew Langston was involved. And I think Franklin Rourke did too." Eleanor closed her eyes, her worst fears confirmed. This wasn't about Duval. This wasn't even about a fraudulent document. This was about power, and the people who would kill to keep it. The car that followed them. The cafe was warm, but Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. She glanced out the window, then froze. A black sedan sat parked across the street. It hadn't been there when they arrived. Angela followed her gaze. "What is it?" Eleanor grabbed her bag. "We need to leave. Now." Angela stiffened but didn't argue. They exited the cafe and walked fast. Down the sidewalk, turning corners, blending into the crowd. But Eleanor's instincts were sharp. The car followed. Not fast, not reckless, but steady. Angela's breathing quickened. "They're watching us." Eleanor's mind raced. Then, an idea. She turned sharply into a bookstore. Angela followed, confused. "What are we doing?" she whispered. Eleanor grabbed a random book from the shelf, pretending to browse. Then she whispered, "We're going to split up." Angela's eyes widened. "What?" Eleanor kept her voice calm and even. "If they're following us," she said, "we need to see if they're after both of us, or just me." Angela hesitated, then nodded. Eleanor handed her a slip of paper. "Go to this address. It's a safe house. I'll meet you there." Angela swallowed. "And if you don't?" Eleanor smirked. "Then you take everything we found today and go straight to the press." Angela gripped the paper tightly. Then she slipped out the back door. Eleanor waited, counted to 10. Then she exited through the front. The black sedan was still there. And when she stepped back onto the sidewalk, it began moving, following her. Eleanor clenched her fists. So it wasn't Angela they wanted. It was her. And that meant only one thing. Someone in power was scared. And scared people made mistakes. A slow, determined smile crept onto Eleanor's face as she walked away, the car tailing her like a shadow. It was time to make them regret underestimating her. Because Eleanor Jackson wasn't done yet. The hunter becomes the hunted. Eleanor Jackson walked with purpose, her heartbeat steady despite the black sedan, crawling behind her like a predator stalking its prey. Her instincts were sharp. She had seen this kind of surveillance before, back when she was fighting some of the biggest cases of her career. This wasn't just someone watching. This was intimidation. And intimidation meant only one thing. They were scared. Eleanor smirked slightly to herself. She was getting too close to something they wanted buried. Now she just had to dig deeper. The pursuit begins. The streets of the city bustled with evening traffic, the sidewalks full of people leaving work, heading to dinner, unaware of the invisible war unfolding between Eleanor and her unseen enemies. She moved carefully, weaving through the crowd, forcing the sit-in to either keep up or expose itself. The driver tried to be subtle, but Eleanor was sharper. At the next crosswalk, she stopped abruptly just as the light changed. Pedestrians surged forward, separating her from the vehicle. She stepped backward, into the entrance of a department store, and waited. Through the glass doors, she watched as the black sit-in kept going. A lesser agent would have panicked, would have doubled back immediately. But not these guys. They were professionals, which meant they wouldn't just keep driving. They would send someone on foot, and Eleanor was ready. A face from the shadows. The moment she saw the man step out of a second car, one parked a block ahead, she knew. Tall, clean-cut, a military posture, wearing a dark suit with an earpiece barely visible. He moved with purpose, scanning the crowd as he walked toward the entrance of the store. He was looking for her. Eleanor's pulse remained steady. She turned, calmly walking toward the elevator. Not too fast, not too slow. No sudden movements. She didn't need him realizing she had made him. She stepped inside the elevator just as the man entered the store. He didn't see her. Not yet. She pressed the basement level. The doors closed, and as the elevator descended, Eleanor exhaled. She had shaken the tail. For now. But she wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. If they were willing to follow her in broad daylight, they were willing to do worse. And that meant she needed a plan. A real one. Fast. A call for help. She exited through a service hallway, stepping out into an alley. The smell of the city, metal, gasoline, damp concrete, was thick in the air. Eleanor pulled out her phone and dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Jackson, I swear to God, if you're calling me after 10 years, you better be dying." Eleanor smirked. "Nice to hear your voice, too, Danny." A sharp sigh. "Damn it, Eleanor. What do you want?" "I need a favor." Danny Mercer had been one of the best private investigators she'd ever known. He was also one of the most paranoid men alive, which made him perfect for what she needed. Danny groaned. "Do you know how many people still owe me favors, Eleanor?" "Too many. I'm trying to retire in peace." "This one's different," Eleanor said. "Different how?" She hesitated. Then she said the name. "Richard Langston." Silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, Danny swore. "Jesus Christ, Eleanor," he muttered. "Are you insane?" "Probably." Danny let out another sigh. "All right. Where are you?" "Not safe," Eleanor said. "But I need everything you can find on Langston's financial operations. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, private dealings, anything that connects him to Duval and this lawsuit against me." Danny was silent again. Then, finally, "You really think you can take him down?" Eleanor's gaze hardened. "I know I can." Danny exhaled sharply. "All right, Jackson. Give me an hour. I'll call you back." She nodded. "Stay off the grid. You don't have to tell me twice." The call ended. Eleanor put her phone away. She had just lit a match. Now, she had to wait for the explosion. A hidden enemy. Eleanor made her way toward the safe house, the address she had given Angela earlier. The safe house was a rundown apartment in a forgotten part of the city, tucked between a warehouse and a laundromat. Angela was already inside, pacing nervously. When Eleanor stepped through the door, Angela jumped. "God, you scared me," she breathed. "Good," Eleanor muttered, shutting the door. "Means your instincts are working." Angela frowned. "Did someone follow you?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted, "but I lost them. For now." Angela swallowed hard. "So what now?" Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down. "Now," she said, "we wait." Angela sat across from her. "Wait for what?" Before Eleanor could answer, her phone buzzed. She checked the number. It was Danny. That was fast. She answered. You got something. Danny's voice was tight. Serious. Eleanor, I don't know what you've stepped into, he said, but this is big. Bigger than I thought. Eleanor sat up straighter. How big? Danny hesitated. Then he said the words that made her blood run cold. Langston isn't just laundering money. He's funding something. Something called Project Dominion. Eleanor's stomach clenched. What the hell is Project Dominion? I don't know, Danny admitted. But whatever it is, people are dying over it. I found evidence of 4 journalists who tried to look into Langston's finances over the past decade. And they all had accidents. Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. Danny continued. One guy fell off a bridge. Another died in a home invasion. One had a heart attack at 35. Angela's eyes widened in horror. Eleanor exhaled. This wasn't just corruption. This was murder. And if Langston had gone this far to silence people, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She was next. Nowhere left to run. Eleanor clenched her jaw. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. She stood up. Angela looked at her nervously. What are you doing? Eleanor grabbed the USB drive from her bag. We're going public. Angela stiffened. Are you sure? If Langston finds out. Eleanor turned to her. He already knows, she said grimly. And he's coming. Angela swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she nodded. Eleanor picked up her phone again. This time, she dialed David Kravitz. The journalist had been after Langston for years. If anyone could get the truth out, it was him. The line rang. Then, finally, Kravitz speaking. Eleanor took a deep breath. David, she said, her voice steady. I have a story for you. The truth has a price. Eleanor gripped the phone tightly as David Kravitz's voice crackled through the line. Jackson. Kravitz's tone was sharp. If you're calling me, that means one of 2 things. Either someone's finally put a bounty on your head, or you've got something so explosive that the ground's about to crack beneath us. Eleanor smirked. Probably both. Kravitz let out a dry chuckle. All right, I'm listening. Angela sat beside her, gripping the USB drive like it was a lifeline. Eleanor took a breath. I have evidence. Asterisk, asterisk, real evidence. Asterisk, asterisk, that Richard Langston has been laundering money through shell companies for years. Offshore accounts. Fake contracts. We can tie it to Duval's real estate empire. But there's more. Kravitz went silent for a second. Then, more. Eleanor's voice was grim. A project. Project Dominion. The line went dead silent. Not even the sound of breathing. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Kravitz. Then, a curse. Jesus Christ, Eleanor. Kravitz hissed. Where the hell did you get that name? Angela stiffened. Eleanor sat up straighter. So you've heard of it. You don't just hear about something like this, Kravitz muttered. You get warnings, whispers in dark corners, and if you ask too many questions, you disappear, Eleanor finished. Kravitz didn't deny it. Eleanor pressed forward. What is it, David? Kravitz exhaled sharply. It's classified, Eleanor. Serious black-budget operations-level stuff. Some say it's about defense contracts. Others say it's about intelligence operations. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know one thing. Langston is at the heart of it. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. That confirmed her worst fears. If Langston was funneling money into something like this, then the fraudulent lawsuit against her was never about property records. It was about silencing her. Angela whispered, Then we need to go public. Fast. Kravitz's voice dropped lower. Eleanor, are you sure you want to do this? Eleanor's gaze hardened. We don't have a choice. Kravitz sighed. All right. Meet me at my office in 1 hour. And Jackson. Yeah. Come armed. The call ended. Eleanor set the phone down, her mind racing. Angela was pale. He sounded scared. He is, Eleanor admitted. And if Kravitz is scared, that means we're running out of time. Angela swallowed hard. So what do we do? Eleanor pulled open a drawer, reaching for a small black pistol. She checked the magazine. Fully loaded. Then she looked up at Angela. We fight back. A trap set in the dark. The drive to Kravitz's office was eerily quiet. Eleanor had taken every back street, avoiding main roads, checking their mirrors every few minutes. Angela gripped the USB drive, her hands shaking slightly. Are you sure about this? Eleanor nodded. Kravitz is the best we've got. If we want the truth to come out, we need him. Angela exhaled. And if Langston knows we're meeting him, then we're walking into a trap, Eleanor said plainly. Angela stared at her. And that doesn't bother you. Eleanor turned the wheel sharply, merging onto a dimly lit street. She didn't look at Angela when she answered. I've been walking into traps my entire life. Angela swallowed hard. Ahead, Kravitz's office loomed, an old brick building tucked between an abandoned warehouse and a rundown diner. No lights. No sign of movement. Eleanor slowed the car. Something felt off. She reached for her gun. Stay here, she told Angela. Angela grabbed her arm. Are you insane? I'm not letting you go in alone. Eleanor looked at her. If something goes wrong, she said, you need to get that USB drive out of here. No matter what. Angela hesitated. Then, reluctantly, nodded. Eleanor stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit against her skin as she moved toward the office. Her instincts screamed at her. Something isn't right. She reached the door. It was unlocked. Bad sign. She pushed it open, slowly, carefully. The office was dark. Too dark. Then, a smell. Something metallic. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She stepped inside. Her foot brushed against something soft. She looked down and froze. A body. Lying on the floor. A gunshot wound to the head. The blood still fresh. Eleanor's chest clenched. She knew that face. David Kravitz. Dead. No more running. Eleanor stepped back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a warning. This was a message. Langston wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was eliminating anyone in his way. Angela burst through the doorway. Eleanor, what's? Then she saw it. She let out a choked gasp. Eleanor grabbed her arm. We need to go. Now. Angela shook her head. He's dead. Oh my God, he's dead. Eleanor's grip tightened. We don't have time for grief. If they got to him, they know we're here. Angela's breathing was rapid, panicked. I don't. Then, headlights. Outside. A black SUV pulling up fast. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Move. She dragged Angela toward the back exit. Footsteps thudded outside. Shadows moved past the windows. Then, voices. Men in suits. Eleanor pushed through the back door, emerging into a narrow alley. Come on. Angela ran beside her. The sound of boots hitting pavement echoed behind them. Then, gunfire. Bullets shredded the brick wall beside them. Angela screamed. Eleanor grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. An old rusted fire escape loomed ahead. Eleanor pointed. Climb. Angela hesitated. Go, damn it. Angela scrambled up the ladder. Eleanor turned, raising her gun. A man in a black suit stepped into the alley, weapon drawn. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She fired. The bullet slammed into his shoulder. He went down. More footsteps. More gunfire. Eleanor climbed the fire escape, metal groaning beneath her weight. She reached the rooftop. Angela was already running across the roof, heart pounding. Below them, the men were shouting orders. But Eleanor wasn't listening anymore. Her pulse was steady. Her mind was clear. She was done running. She looked at Angela. "We take the fight to Langston." Angela swallowed. "How?" Eleanor's gaze hardened. "We crash his press conference." Angela's eyes widened. "You're serious?" Eleanor smiled coldly. "As a heart attack." Below, the men spread out, searching. But Eleanor and Angela were already gone. And the war was only just beginning. Crashing the party. The rooftop was cold beneath Eleanor's hands as she crouched, watching the streets below. The men in black suits, Langston's men, were scattering like wolves, searching for them. But they were too late. Eleanor and Angela had already slipped away, their shadows lost in the city's maze of alleys. They had survived the ambush. Now, it was time to end this war. Angela was breathing hard, gripping the edge of the rooftop. "You really want to do this?" she whispered. "Go after Langston in public." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with determination. "It's the only way." The press conference. Angela stared at the live news feed on her phone. It showed Langston standing before a crowd of reporters outside the Capitol building. His voice was smooth, confident, full of lies. "This is a baseless attack on my integrity," Langston was saying. "There is no evidence, none, that ties me to any criminal activity." Eleanor smirked. That was about to change. Angela looked at her. "How do we even get close? The place is crawling with security." Eleanor exhaled, thinking fast. "We don't go in through the front. We come in from the inside." Angela frowned. "How?" Eleanor tapped her temple. "I still have contacts. People who owe me favors." She pulled out her phone and dialed. The line rang twice. Then a woman's voice answered. "Jackson," the woman said. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Eleanor smiled. "I need a way into Langston's press conference." Quietly. The woman sighed. "You're lucky I like you. Meet me in 20 minutes. Side entrance, West Wing." The call ended. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Who was that?" Eleanor tucked the phone into her pocket. "A friend," she said. "Now let's move." A secret way in. The Capitol's West Wing was less guarded than the front entrance, mostly reserved for media personnel and trusted staffers. That's where Sarah Monroe was waiting for them. A tall, sharp-eyed woman in a professional gray suit, Sarah was an old friend from Eleanor's days in Washington. She had spent years working in investigative journalism before switching sides, becoming a political strategist. But most importantly, she hated Langston. Sarah smirked as Eleanor approached. "I should have guessed you'd be at the center of all this chaos." Eleanor shrugged. "I have a reputation to maintain." Sarah held up 2 press badges. "These will get you inside," she said. "Once you're in, you're on your own. Make it count." Eleanor nodded. "You just gave us our shot. We won't waste it." Sarah's expression darkened. "Be careful. Langston's people play dirty." Eleanor smirked. "So do I." Inside the lion's den, Eleanor and Angela slipped into the Capitol building, blending in with the sea of reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones hovered in the air, waiting to capture every word. On stage, Langston was still talking, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "This is nothing more than a politically motivated attack," he said, "and I assure you, the truth will prevail." Eleanor exhaled. It was time. She nudged Angela. "Ready?" Angela swallowed, then nodded. Eleanor stepped forward and raised her voice. "Senator Langston, a question." The crowd stirred. Langston turned toward her, his polished smile never faltering. "Ah, a member of the press," he said smoothly. "Go ahead, Ms." Eleanor smirked. "Jackson," she said. Langston's expression froze. For just a fraction of a second. Then, he recovered. But Eleanor saw it. She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. "Ms. Jackson," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I wasn't aware you were a journalist now." "I'm not," Eleanor said. Then she pulled out the USB drive and held it up for the entire world to see. The room erupted. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists turned toward her. Langston's security tensed. Eleanor's voice was sharp as steel. "You said there was no evidence," she said. "Well, Senator, here it is." Live on air. Angela was already one step ahead. She plugged the USB into a nearby laptop, one of the broadcasting computers, and hit the button. Suddenly, every screen in the room flickered. Langston's face disappeared and was replaced by files, documents, bank records, offshore transactions, all tied to Langston. Gasps filled the air. A journalist shouted, "What is this?" Eleanor's voice rang out. "This," she said, "is proof that Richard Langston has spent years laundering money into Project Dominion." A second wave of shock. People turned to Langston. The senator was pale. Eleanor pressed forward. Project Dominion, a black-budget operation funneling money through shell companies, bribing officials, covering up crimes. "And if you still don't believe me," she pointed at the screen, "here's your proof." A video file played. And then, Marissa Carter's face appeared. Langston staggered, because the recording was of a dead woman. The whistleblower's last words. The video was grainy but clear. Marissa Carter sat in a dimly lit room, looking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this," she said, "it means I'm dead." The room went silent. Marissa swallowed hard. "They're going to come for me. But before they do, I need the world to know the truth." She held up a folder of documents. "Richard Langston has been running an illegal financial network for over 20 years, she said. "I have proof. Bank records, wire transfers. Everything ties back to something called Project Dominion." Langston's face was stone. But his eyes, they were burning with rage. Marissa's voice wavered. "I don't know how long I have, but I have to get this to Eleanor Jackson." Angela squeezed Eleanor's hand. Marissa took a shaky breath. "Eleanor," she said in the recording, "if you're watching this, finish what I started." Then, the screen cut to black. The room erupted into chaos. Langston's fall. Journalists screamed questions. Security rushed forward. But Eleanor stood tall. Langston's mask was gone. His eyes were wild, desperate. Eleanor turned to the cameras. "Senator Langston," she said, "do you deny this evidence?" Langston didn't answer, because he couldn't. His empire, his entire world, was collapsing in real time. Suddenly, FBI agents stormed the room. One of them stepped forward. "Senator Langston," the agent said, "you're under arrest." Langston staggered. Then he ran. But it was over. The agents tackled him before he reached the exit. Cameras flashed. Reporters yelled. Eleanor exhaled. It was done. Langston's reign was over. And Marissa Carter's truth had finally come to light. The war was won. Eleanor and Angela stood outside the Capitol, breathing in the night air. Angela turned to Eleanor. "What now?" Eleanor smiled. "Now," she said, "we rest." Angela smirked. "And after that?" Eleanor chuckled. "Then we go after the next corrupt bastard." Angela laughed. And together, they walked into the future. Justice had finally won. The aftermath, and a new war. The Capitol steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras, frantic reporters, and the fading echoes of a fallen empire. Richard Langston, the once untouchable senator, the mastermind behind Project Dominion, was now in handcuffs, being led into a black SUV by federal agents. His face was frozen in fury, his polished mask shattered. Eleanor Jackson watched him go, standing tall in the middle of the storm she had unleashed. Beside her, Angela Carter clutched the USB drive, the evidence that had brought down one of the most powerful men in America. "It's over." Angela's voice was barely a whisper, almost as if she didn't believe it. Eleanor exhaled. "Not yet." Angela frowned. What do you mean? Langston's going to prison. We won. Eleanor shook her head, her sharp gaze sweeping the chaos around them. No, kid, she said quietly. We just took out one head of the Hydra. Angela swallowed, the weight of Eleanor's words sinking in. Langston had fallen. But the system that protected him, that built him, it was still alive. And it would strike back, a target on their backs. The moment Langston was shoved into the SUV, a man in a dark suit emerged from the crowd. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't a politician. He was something else. He moved too smoothly, his presence too controlled. Eleanor recognized the type instantly. Government. Intelligence. The kind of person who operated in the gray space between legal and illegal, right and wrong. The man adjusted his tie and approached. Ms. Jackson, he said in a low voice. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Who's asking? The man gave a slight smirk, but there was no amusement in it. Langston may be gone, he said, but the people he worked for, they're still watching. And now, you've made yourself their problem. Angela stiffened beside Eleanor. Eleanor, however, didn't flinch. She had spent her life in courtrooms, going up against powerful men. She had spent her career exposing the kind of rot that made people disappear. So this wasn't new. Let them watch, Eleanor said. And when they come, I'll be waiting. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, with a knowing nod, he turned and disappeared into the sea of people. Angela let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eleanor, she whispered. Who was that? Eleanor's expression darkened. Someone who just confirmed what I already knew, she said. We rattled the right cage. Angela glanced at the disappearing figure. And that's a good thing. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It means they're scared, she said. And scared people make mistakes. Angela swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if that comforted her or terrified her. The fallout begins. The next morning, the world woke up to a scandal unlike any other. The footage of Langston's arrest, the leaked documents from Project Dominion, and the final chilling words of Marissa Carter played on every major news network. The headlines screamed. Senator Langiston Aristides. Shocking money IUND ring and black OPS connections exposed. Who else knew? More politicians under investigation. Whistleblowers MESSAG from the grave brings down a titan. Eleanor sat in a quiet diner, sipping coffee as the TV blared the news. Angela sat across from her, scrolling through her phone. Langston's people are scattering like rats, Angela murmured. The FBI just raided one of his corporate fronts in Chicago. Another senator is under investigation. This is getting bigger. Eleanor nodded, but her mind was already ahead. She had been here before. Cases like this, they didn't end with one arrest. The machine behind Langston had many layers, many faces, and one of them would step up to replace him. The question was, who? Angela suddenly stiffened. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor looked up. What? Angela turned the phone toward her. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Her stomach clenched as she read it. Eleanor Jackson under investigation. DOJOPENS INQUIRY into ALEGT. LEGAL MISCONDBCT. Eleanor felt a slow burn of fury rise in her chest. They were already coming after her, trying to discredit her, trying to shut her up. Angela's hands trembled. They're trying to make it look like you're corrupt too. They want to bury your reputation. Eleanor set her coffee down and leaned back in her chair. She wasn't surprised. This was how the game worked. Angela looked at her, uncertainty in her eyes. What do we do now? Eleanor's lips curled into a dangerous smirk. Now, she said, we play dirty. A dangerous offer. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone in her dimly lit apartment. The world outside was changing because of what she had done. She had set a fire. Now the people who once thought themselves untouchable were scrambling to put it out. But then, a knock at the door. She reached for her gun before answering. When she opened it, she found a familiar face. Sarah Monroe, her friend, her informant. But tonight, her expression was grim. Eleanor stepped aside. "What is it?" Sarah walked in, shutting the door behind her. "You've got a problem," she said, "and it's bigger than you think." Eleanor folded her arms. Bigger than taking down one of the most powerful senators in America. Sarah's eyes were serious. Bigger than that. She placed a file on the table. Eleanor opened it and froze. Inside were photographs, documents, surveillance reports. But one name stood out among them. Philip Aldrin. Angela gasped behind her. "Who is that?" Sarah exhaled. "The next man in line." Eleanor's jaw clenched. Aldrin was more powerful than Langston. More dangerous. Langston was greedy. But Aldrin, he was a kingmaker. And now, with Langston out of the picture, he was moving the pieces. Sarah looked at Eleanor. "You have two choices," she said. "You can walk away and let this die." Eleanor let out a dark chuckle. "Not happening." Sarah smirked. "Then get ready," she said, "because if you go after Aldrin..." She met Eleanor's gaze. "This time, they won't just try to discredit you." Eleanor nodded. She already knew. "They'll try to kill me." Angela swallowed hard. "So, what do we do?" Eleanor stared at the file, at Aldrin's name. Then she smiled. "We take the war to them." And just like that, the hunt began again.